hit recording. Thanks. So I'm Catherine Morris with CBI. I'm going to be subbing in for David Plum today. And this is the April 3rd meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Steering Committee meeting. I want to turn it over first to Secretary Klauser to just welcome you and review the agenda.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everybody. Looking at the agenda for today, we'll spend the first big chunk of the meeting, about 40 minutes, on a debrief of our in-person council meeting on March 13th. At 12:45, we will discuss the Just Transition memo sent to the council. And then the next chunk of the meeting, starting at 1 o'clock, will be council prep for the agenda for our next meeting in April 24th, and to set a steering committee schedule moving forward. We'll end with public comment at 1:25, and then hopefully adjourn right on time at 1:30.
Thank you. So let me drop the agenda into the chat for those who may not have it in front of you. Oh, somebody did. Thank you. Thank you, Marion. And the first order of business would be approval of the March 6th meeting minutes. And that was, you can also, Marion, either you or I guess, could drop that in. Thank you. Jane did. So wanted to take any comments or edits, changes to the March 6th meeting minutes. Okay, hearing none, we'll take these minutes to be approved. As Secretary Klauser said, we're going to spend the bulk of this meeting debriefing about the March meeting, the March in-person meeting on the 13th. And for those, you'll see the agenda is a little bit more detailed this time, because we wanted to specifically call out some of the items that we both as the facilitators and note takers took away from that meeting, and we'll certainly invite you to add any additional action items you want to discuss. But just to be clear, the purpose of, at least for this meeting, is not to specifically resolve any of these action items. It's really to just make sure we have a process for resolving them, and making sure that we know who would be responsible for taking those action items forward. You'll see on the list, and I'm happy to share my screen if that would be helpful. So you'll see on the list at the beginning of the agenda that we had a couple of items defined specifically for possible steering committee action. And we can discuss whether that's appropriate, but we wanted to take those up first. And then also there's some items on there that are already underway. They came out of the meeting, but they're already underway by the Climate Action Office. So we'll talk about those a bit. Some of this is taken away from, you remember at the meeting, we did an exercise where we had everybody go into smaller groups and do a timeline and sort of put on a piece of paper priority tasks. And in reviewing those, we didn't have time, unfortunately, to review those during the meeting, but did take a look at those and do kind of a cross cut of where specific items were really appearing for each of those groups. The process roadmap revisions was right at the top of everybody's list, along with really starting the public engagement process that we heard about later in that meeting. So the process roadmap revisions will require a pretty substantial effort. People characterize it as being anywhere from, modifications to, major changes. And at the close of that discussion, a couple of folks did suggest that the steering committee take the lead on that. So we want to talk about, what if the steering committee is up to that task, and what support you would need to actually do that work. The other one was clarify, as part really of that process roadmap revision, was making very clear how, I don't think this was addressed in the original roadmap, but how addendums would be considered and adopted by the commission, by the council. And that's particularly important because we are going to probably take up the biomass task force. That was also a very important item that everybody wanted to see taken up at the next council meeting. So that would be treated as an addendum, and want to talk a little bit today about how you see, or the urgent, how we would address the process or development of the process for adoption of that addendum. It seems like something that needs to be talked about and discussed, and you'll see in the agenda for the council that it is an item that we've put forward as something that should be addressed by the council before they actually even talk about the task group's recommendations. I may not have the other issue is a work plan. There was a recognition at the last meeting that we needed to have, that you wanted to have a work plan that prioritized the tasks for the next 2 years, or certainly for the next year, and then really go down into the level of detail of how we're going to prioritize those tasks and how what pace the council will take them on board. The other item that was not actually brought up at the last meeting, but it was brought up at the Just Transition subcommittee meeting, was whether or not we should talk about ways to better handle public comment. That kind of became apparent at the last meeting that we were not really able to finalize the work that we had on the agenda. The public comment period was only slotted for 15 minutes, took up well over 45 minutes. And I'm not sure, as somebody who was trying to manage that, I'm certainly willing to take feedback on how that could have been done more effectively. But we had, a lot of public comment. We had a fair amount of time given to the council members trying to respond to that comment. And I'm not sure that overall anybody walked away feeling particularly satisfied with how that went. So suggesting here that maybe we need to think about that at the steering committee level, perhaps, but also at the full council level, since it's a part of every meeting. And then I understand that there is an issue here, which is, again, overall, it's a issue that has to be taken up as part of the process roadmap, but maybe more urgent for the steering committee to think about how to recruit new members and what that process looks like. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are other items, action items that you would like to see on this list that we could think about. Again, what is the process for taking them forward, and not necessarily dealing with them, resolving them today. Let me, if I'm not catching folks. Anything else anybody wants to add? Yeah, Liz.
I don't know if it's an addition or a clarification, but I wondered whether we shouldn't be taking the process roadmap revisions piece, I guess, which is the first thing on the list, in chunks. And like specifically what I was wondering is, given that we're in our kind of second term, shouldn't we be thinking about the steering committee composition, and recruitment first? Because if there are changes that need to be made there or will be made there, perhaps that group should then be doing some of the rest of the process. I'm a little bit worried that if we do it all together, that might be out of order. But if I'm the only one worried about that, I guess I'm just putting it out there to see if others have thoughts on that.
I'll just offer, Liz, that I totally hear what you're saying. I will say, I think that the kind of order and the timing is a little bit challenged in that different groups of counselors are on different timeframes. So for the House appointees, while it's a second term, those of us who were appointed by the Senate are still in our first term, so to speak, in terms of the timing. And so I think that, we have discussed, I guess I actually don't remember off the top of my head when the steering committee was first appointed. I believe it was sometime in the winter of, like the beginning of, I don't know if it was the winter of 2020/2021, I think. So I think it's been at least 2 years. And so I think that one of the questions is the length of those terms and what our process is for identifying, possible new steering committees and who's willing to stand for serve in those roles. And then, what is the point at which we make those decisions? And since it's not laid out in the process roadmap now, I wonder if it's something that this current group needs to, maybe that's what we could start with to agree on that. And then the next step in the process.
That's what I was wondering about exactly, Jared, whether we start with that, and then that might answer the question, because perhaps there'll be new membership for some of us, maybe there won't be, but either way we'll know, right? And then move on from there. That's it exactly in terms of what I was thinking.
Any other reactions? That suggestion? I mean, it's logical, right? If the steering committee is going to be charged with doing this stuff, the steering committee, we need to understand how the steering committee is going to be made up and whether there's going to be any further changes. And I guess to your point, Liz, it also just seems logical that you'd have to take the process roadmap in chunks because you can't do it all at once. So maybe another task is just looking at the roadmap and identifying the most urgent gaps or changes. I know decision-making, and as I said, as we started this meeting, sort of how addendums are adopted is another one that probably needs, attention in the near term, because it's going to be something that's coming up. Secretary Clauser.
So speaking to that particular point and how addendums are to be adopted and what's more urgent, and I guess kind of piggybacking a bit off of Liz's point of separating and taking this in chunks, to me, addendums that are relevant to work that was part of the first plan, right? Part of the initial climate action plan, but just needed more time to develop. It seems to me that should follow the established practice for the climate action plan. That's how we did the transportation amendment. It feels strange to change course to do the kind of that last piece, but happy to hear other folks' thoughts. So then in terms of kind of bifurcation, it seems like going forward, addendums and how addendums are added, if at all, moving forward in this interim process prior to the next iteration of the plan, or the update of the plan rather, that seems to be maybe a separate, less urgent question and more tied to the kind of process roadmap moving forward, as opposed to determining how addendums are added currently, because the only one before us is kind of a hangover from the initial plan.
So just for my clarification, so you're distinguishing between the biomass task group addendum as something that sort of just is a delayed piece of the original plan versus any future addendums after that.
That's right.
Okay, so thanks. I mean, again, I don't know that we need to have a decision today on that. I think that's really a good start to that conversation about how we're going to deal with addendums. Because the biomass task group recommendations are coming up in the next meeting, we do need to have at least if not a suggestion, maybe a process to suggest to the council for how that will be handled. So we've covered most of these. The work plan was the other big chunk of work that came out of that meeting. And we had a fair amount of discussion about how to prioritize tasks. That definitely everybody wanted to prioritize tasks and talk about different criteria we could use for that. I just want to confirm whether or not the steering committee sees this as, again, sort of within their ability and willingness to take on as a first draft anyway for the council, or if you would suggest a different approach. Jared?
I would be happy to work on, I mean, it's certainly the first piece that Liz brought up. I think that there's a lot of different options to think through, and I'd be happy to draft some of those options. I don't think I'd be comfortable at this point putting forward a recommendation because it's not entirely clear to me what the best path forward is, but I think we could at least frame up some options to choose between for how we handle at least the steering committee decision-making portion that we want to address up front. I would also be happy to work on the other pieces that have been identified, as long as I am on the steering committee to help frame things up for the further steering committee deliberation, and then eventually for the council's deliberation and decision.
And Jared, can I just ask specifically on the work plan itself and developing criteria for prioritizing tasks? Do you see that as something that you personally, you're saying you personally would be willing to, do you see that as within the bailiwick of the steering committee at this stage, first stage?
I mean, I think it is an important conversation to advance, and I don't know where else is the natural starting point. I think I wouldn't want to close off any counselor's ability to provide input and direction on that, but I do think that there is a kind of who takes the initiative to frame up and begin the conversation. And if it's not with the steering committee, I don't necessarily know where that is. I mean, we might try to have like an ad hoc working group of counselors, but I think that you know, another option is maybe a hybrid, that there's some steering committee members, if there's capacity and interest beyond me, I don't want to volunteer, other folks could offer to host that conversation and see if other counselors want to join as almost like a working group of the council. But I'm curious what other people think.
Excuse me. I worry a little bit, just having reflected on the last meeting, that we almost, before we can set to revising the process roadmap, I think we need to establish shared expectations for all counselors in terms of the level of effort that people are putting in. That seemed like a pretty clear piece of feedback. That we've never done that, and as a result, there are people who feel like, oh, are you having a hard time hearing me?
No, I can hear you.
Can.
Brothers?
It was just very, very low. I don't know if others were hearing.
Let's see. I just pushed the plug in on my thing a little further. Is that better at all?
Yeah, that works for me.
All right. Just that I think we need to do a little bit of kind of expectation setting or something bigger before we get into the substance of the roadmap. Like Sue had made a comment about capacity. I think Kelly or someone else had made a comment about capacity, and how can we write essentially a roadmap and a scope of work without having it be cabined in a little bit by how much counselors can realistically be expected to do.
I recall somebody throwing out number of hours per month, in fact.
Yeah, I think that was Sue. I think she had said 2 to
Yeah.
4 hours per month. I don't know that anyone else was that specific, but that capacity question, right? Like you would never write a scope of work for a project app without thinking about how many hours or dollars, if you're a consultant, are available to actually put to the task. And I don't know that we've had that kind of conversation with ourselves, but I think it is really important and speaks to my mind to some of the other concerns we heard at the council meeting, of people feeling that voices have uneven weight. I think it's in part a reflection of some folks, everyone is giving what they can, but those contributions aren't equal. And as a result, it feels, I think at times, unfair to some.
Well, I think, Julie, your comment goes to sort of this question we have right in front of the steering committee right now, which is how much time does the steering committee have to take on, these tasks as a starting point for the council. It will not be a minor level of effort to even just the process roadmap, much less the work plan itself. And then I think those are the two biggest issues right now. But so I am interested in hearing also from the other steering committee members about whether or not you think, one, this is a reasonable ask of the steering committee members to take these things on, and two, if to Julie's sort of comment, whether you would want to also take on some way of translating a work plan into expectations in terms of time required by the counselors themselves.
I mean, to me, it feels a little bit kind of like a chicken and egg question. And I totally hear what Secretary Moore, what you're saying. I also think that, one of the options would be to craft a work plan that is reflective of some of what we heard from counselors, trying to incorporate, a work plan and priorities that reflect limited time and capacity, and really focusing on, the most important pieces rather than everything that could be tackled. I don't know that as though there's a kind of perfect order there, because I think both need to happen, and they're probably interrelated.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me actually sort of reframe this. At the next council meeting, one of the expectations would be that the steering committee would affirmatively or not say that they would be willing, to put forward a process where the steering committee would be willing to take on the first draft of a process roadmap revisions as well, and perhaps calling out the need to prioritize some things over others, and then the work plan, and how to address that, how to address a work plan and the level of effort required for that work plan. And maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's just a 1-year work plan with a longer, in more detail with a longer term, kind of more in the abstract. But would you be comfortable at, presenting that to the council at their next meeting as a way forward? And if so, what help would you expect? I mean, is this something that you would literally take on additional meeting time in order to accomplish? Would you want help from others, CBI or staff? Yeah, Liz.
Probably had my hand thinking I was raising before your very last question, but I wonder whether we shouldn't do something that I can't remember if it was Secretary Moore or Jared who raised it, but agree that the steering committee will take a first shot at the process roadmap pieces, particularly those that clarify membership in the steering committee, perhaps membership on committees. I can't remember if that's something we need to clarify with kind of change in appointments, as well as process for further addendums, those sort of like initial procedural steps, and then suggest essentially an ad hoc group for the work plan that consists of steering committee members and other committee members. I'm thinking particularly that although it would be a lot to just suggest that committee chairs sit on that, it would be nice to have representation by the various committees given the work plan. So we could just suggest, I'm going to put it out there as a suggestion, that we set that up as an ad hoc group that includes steering committee, but is not just steering committee. And that way, if folks want to join it specifically, I hear Secretary Moore's point about defining, among other things, in that work plan, what type of time commitment it's going to require. So anyway, that's my suggestion, that we take on the initial process piece revisions of the roadmap, and that we get an ad hoc group, including us, but not just us, to put together the work plan.
We have a thumbs up from Secretary Clauser on that idea. And did you say, sort of as a ideal situation, you wanted to the chairs of the subcommittees to participate as part of that, or
They certainly would be free to be, yeah, they'd be free to be on it, but I would prioritize more than anything else, representation across committees,
Okay.
just given the topics.
Okay.
I think it would be particularly important to have the Just Transition Subcommittee represented in that conversation. Like, I think that capacity piece is probably most central to their work, and certainly the concerns we've heard expressed for people stepping down from that committee have largely been about the demands placed on their time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just ask one more time in terms of, if you had this ad hoc committee for the work plan and the steering committee took on the at least 2 priority tasks we've identified for the process roadmap to start. Any other support that you would want in terms of actually drafting that? I think you could probably expect some facilitation support from CBI for those convenings, for the planning work group meetings that you held. Anything else you would need?
Yeah, I mean, my recollection is that while there were multiple counselors involved in the initial process roadmap, a lot of work happened in the steering committee. So I think it's good for a lot of the folks who worked on it to return to it. I personally would also really appreciate the kind of institutional memory that was provided the first time, then the feedback that has then been directed to both Jane and CBI in terms of, oh, well, we didn't anticipate this, or this needs to be addressed. So I do think it would be really helpful in that process to be able to involve facilitation support through CBI, and Jane played such an important facilitation and information gathering role as well, both then and has been, I think, a primary person who has received feedback about limitations, questions, gaps in that process roadmap sense.
Yeah, I
Nodding
think
your
it's-
head. Go ahead.
I think it's important for Jane to weigh in, but I think that this is a council document. I know she and David had done sort of yeoman's work in drafting the initial process map, and the role of the steering committee and the council, frankly, was one more to react to it. I'm not sure the steering committee existed when most of the drafting was going on. I think that was part of what we created as a result of the roadmap. But I don't think it sits with the climate office at this point. I think it sits with the council, and we need to take the leadership role in preparing that document.
Liz, your hand is still up. Is that just a reminder? Okay. All right. So let me just recap what I think was been generally agreed to, and that would be that the steering committee members would take the lead on drafting the more urgent elements of the process roadmap revisions needed. One being the way subcommittees are created and recruited, and members recruited, particularly the steering committee, since it has to do some of that. And then two, the process for considering and adopting addendums, which may be, as Secretary Clauser said, a continuation of the way it's been done in the past. But at least, you know, that there will be a concerted effort to talk about that and what any changes that might be needed around that. Two, that the steering committee would invite members of subcommittees to join it in development of a work plan that prioritizes tasks and also considers those tasks in light of the time constraints that the council has expressed. Limit
But
time.
I would just not members necessarily. I think we were talking maybe co-chairs. Ideally would be the ones that could participate from the subcommittees.
Well, Jared amended that to say, you know, any committee member, or somebody amended it, I believe, saying any committee member would be good, but
I worry about getting outside of council members having input on the council process roadmap.
Yeah, so my suggestion was other council members were interested. I agree with both
Okay.
Liz and Secretary Moore that just in terms of ensuring kind of the perspective being represented would be ideal to have co-chairs of subcommittees, but in the event that, you know, co-chairs are not able, I do think that other council members who are steering or on those subcommittees would be valuable participants in the work planning.
thank you very much for the clarification. Okay. The issue of public comment, we haven't talked about much. I thought that might be an issue to bring up to the council. And so given the time, let me first turn it to Jane just to talk about some of the work that they're doing at the Climate Action Council, at the Climate Action Office, on some of the other action items that came out of the meeting.
Thanks, Catherine. I guess I want to first start by acknowledging that I think my takeaway from the last Climate Council meeting for me was that I think the Climate Council, and I ask this of all of you, would benefit from regular updates from the Climate Action Office at the beginning of quarterly meetings or however you deem appropriate or fit, to just an update on the work that the Climate Action Office is engaged in, so that not as to direct the work of the Climate Action Office, but to be informed as much of the work is either in support of moving forward implementation of the Climate Action Plan or in, you know, complementary of. And so I think it would just be beneficial to have a grounding in the work that's actually moving forward from the office to support the then separate and direct priorities of the council and work planning that can happen outside of the Climate Action Office in support of the work of the council. So a few of the things that I heard as direct takeaways from the council as priorities, I just wanted to provide a brief update on, and won't be inclusive of everything that you were thinking of, but just wanted to highlight that first and foremost, the Climate Action Office is currently moving forward with a prioritization of actions in the Climate Action Plan to further consider a gap analysis around the state role of moving forward actions from the CAP. We have a suite of interns who are working with us to take the spreadsheets that were put forward for the climate plan and actually take them to the next step with respect to identifying a lead implementer, and then thinking about how we can track in a simplistic way in lieu of moving forward with the measuring and tracking progress tool in greater detail over the next few years, a process that speaks to how implementation is or isn't moving forward with specific actions from the plan. We're looking closely at the way the PSD tracks action on the CEP and trying to create something similar in that space. I really see that as important work and identifying the role of government in moving forward actions from the CAP, and just wanted to signal that is something that we're thinking a lot about here as we move to stand up the measuring and tracking progress tool. And then, as you all know, and had a preview of with CBI at the meeting in March, we're moving forward with, first and foremost, the hiring right now of a community engagement and communications coordinator as a core position of the Climate Action Office. We just finished screening candidates and are moving forward with scheduling first round interviews. We have a great hiring team that also touches on capacity within the EJ office, appreciating the direct connection this position will have with coordinating engagement with the EJ unit in ANR, and know that that person will help us think about a vision for climate community engagement, as well as a communication strategy for the Climate Action Office. And I think it will be really important with that married with the work of CBI and the contract in the community engagement space to be able to provide updates to the Climate Council on the kinds of engagement the Climate Action Office is leading, so that those efforts can be brought into the process of influencing priorities for the Climate Council. So just wanted to note that those were core components that you lifted up at the March meeting and things that the Climate Action Office sees as core priorities of our work, and something that we can keep a report out to the council on, so you can understand how we're moving forward with that work.
Any questions for Jane or comments?
And you'll see later on the agenda, I'll just flag, when we start to prospectively think about future council meetings, it'd be great to hear from you what an interval of updates would be best suited for the council from the Climate Action Office, and understanding that the April meeting is probably really busy and we don't want to overpack an agenda, are happy to consider an update for April, but also happy to wait to the next meeting when there might be more time to really give it thought.
Before we move to the next topic, the Just Transitions memo, let me just ask one more time, is there anything else coming out of that meeting that you'd like to talk about? Public comment. Again, I noted in the Just Transition subcommittee meeting that they addressed that and the challenge of trying to balance making time for the public, making time for responding to the public comments, as well as, you know, making sure that we still have enough time for the council to, or you know, whether it's the council or subcommittees to do their work and to complete that. Let me ask the steering committee members if there's anything else, and then TJ, I see you have your hand up, and I'll come to you. And after that, steering committee members, do you have anything else that you wanted us to reflect on from that last meeting? Okay, TJ.
Yeah, and maybe I should have brought this up earlier, but in terms of reflecting on the last meeting, I think one of the points that came out of it that there was some discussion around is really what is the expectation of council members in terms of their communicating about the climate action plan, just publicly or you know, with the legislature. And it seemed to me that the meeting was heading towards having some sort of kind of just like clarity in role, whether that turns into a written document and kind of to guide counselors or at least discussing it. And I just you know, there was quite a bit of time and discussion spent on that, and I don't think now would be a time for resolution, but I want to just make sure that that's kind of on the list, whether it's in the process roadmap or, you know, in talking about the expectations and the time spent of counselors, but somewhere in there, kind of how counselors are, you know, expected to engage kind of on their own when all of the counselors kind of wear multiple hats.
Understood. Yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up. And you're right, it was something that was brought up in a number of different places throughout the meeting, and curious from the other steering committee members, do you see that as something that is appropriately falling within the process roadmap? Something to be incorporated in writing as to how the council might want to communicate, or is it less formal than that? Is it really just a sort of an understanding that needs to be discussed at the whole council level?
I think it probably serves us well to have it be part of the process roadmap, if for no other reason, that there's quite a bit of potential transition within council members, and not having it written down could quickly mean it no longer exists. So I think that that's a good thing to look at a way to incorporate into the process roadmap.
Jared, did you have a follow-on comment? And no.
Just similar, that I think it's worth reviewing what is in the process roadmap, and if we identify that we want additional kind of clarity, that I agree that it's helpful to add it in that place so that we have kind of as much as possible. I know that there are different decisions that get made and they're kind of captured in different ways, but I think as much as possible, it's helpful to have one kind of main document that lays out our process agreements as a council.
Okay, well noted.
Catherine, can I shift back to I have a question for you actually about public comment. I'm wondering, I mean, CBI obviously has significant breadth of experience and depth of experience in running a whole range, I'm assuming, of public meetings and processes. And I wonder if it's possible to ask for CBI to give us some options and alternatives for ways that we could create meaningful public engagement, how other entities you've engaged with have responded to public comment. I know that that's a big piece of it, and I can sort of go back and forth between, it's hard to feel your comments are heard if somebody isn't reflecting back to you sort of in the moment what was said, and at the same time, our ability to continue to do the work that lies in front of us, and just I think would benefit from having a little bit of a sense for what you see as possible approaches that may be more successful than where we're currently at.
I think that's a reasonable ask. It's interesting that we're actually having a debate about this topic internally in light of this Massachusetts court decision you may have heard of, where a judge has said that in response to a case brought before him by a public member that was exited from a meeting that they were considered to be disruptive at, that, you know, this decision was that it is sort of a First Amendment right for the public to do and say anything in any form that might take, which, you know, for somebody, an organization like ours, which is trying to figure out how do you combine the public's right to express dissent, certainly, and even protest, with, you know, governing bodies need to actually deliberate and hear and take in and process and give every voice an opportunity, you know, to speak, not just the loudest and the longest. So I definitely think we would be interested in trying to provide you with some of that, you know, what we're talking about internally and debating internally, as well as our just longer term experience. Because obviously, you know, we would like to see the process work for both sides, right? For the public, as you said, to be heard without completely overtaking the council's and the subcommittee's work to actually try to move the process forward. Okay, So I appreciate you suggesting that, and unless Jane thinks it's completely outside our scope of work, I think, I know David would probably be interested in helping with that.
Thank you. I think it would be helpful just to have some options on the table. So I appreciate that.
So I want to turn it over to Kelly Klein, counselor, and also the co-chair of the Just Transition Subcommittee, and to just move us into this next session, which is, and I'll get rid of this, stop sharing, the Just Transition memo that was shared with you in advance. And then we can talk a little bit about how we would like the council to take that up. Kelly, I saw you were on a little early. Glad
Yes.
you joined us.
Yes, thanks. Glad I could be here. Abby, my co-chair, is also here, Abby Willard.
Great.
So she has to jump off at 1, but I can stick around longer if need be. So thank you. I guess I want to know if I should walk through this memo at all, if everyone's already had a chance to review it. It was linked in the agenda. I don't need to go back over things you've already read, but we'd like to get this on the agenda for the next council meeting so that it can be reviewed. And someone remind me, are we actually seeking some sort of like thumbs up from the council, or more just opportunity to review it, ask questions?
I think that's sort of to be determined by the steering committee on the in right now. I mean, is how you'd like to have it presented, and what kind of action you'd like the council to take on it. I mean, I'm assuming the Just Transition Subcommittee has action you would like them to take. I mean, do you have a recommendation?
Yeah. Right. Well, and I think, and Abby, correct me if this doesn't seem accurate, but I think what we want is, this is the subcommittee is putting this forward as, this is how we would like to continue to do our job and what we were asked to do and how it was outlined in the Global Warming Solutions Act. This is the best way we think we can help, and this is what we would like to do going forward. And I do think at least some sort of blessing from the council would probably be helpful in that, just to say, yes, this sounds right, you are doing the right things, let's keep moving forward. And it also involves an ask for the council and the subcommittees, other subcommittees, to bring things to our committee. So that's something that we certainly want everyone on board with.
Yeah, I would agree, Kelly. I think the idea is, this is the subcommittee's best representation of how we'd like to see our role and function within the Climate Council and the CAP work continue for the coming year, or coming period of time, and just would like confirmation from the steering committee and the council that they're supportive of these strategies that we've outlined. So there's 5 strategies that we've provided in the memo.
And I didn't hear your full conversation about the process roadmap, but this potentially could be something that's incorporated into that. And we'd already been working on this when that came up as the next step for the council. So we figured it, hopefully we're helping.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone has questions or wants me to walk through in a little bit more detail, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, Liz.
Yeah, I don't have any questions, and I did review the memo, but I have a couple of, I think, reflections back on what you just said to make sure I'm getting it, and maybe for the benefit of other steering committee members. When I looked at it, it felt to me like you're right. It's either referred to in the process roadmap, you know, even if it's a standalone document, or perhaps even incorporated into the work plan, in the sense of like, because what it looks like you're asking for, and I'm just looking for confirmation that I get this right, is that subcommittees in particular, but then obviously the council as a whole, sort of take on more of the effort of bringing to it, first of all, doing the review and screening, and then bringing it to the Just Transition Committee to make sure, yeah, I'm seeing you nod, that the subcommittee has gotten it right, that you get feedback from those outside the subcommittee, okay, with expertise. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it feels to me like it's at least a reference in the process roadmap. It's probably also incorporated into the work plan, because really each subcommittee should have as a part of its work stream to do the check-ins and come to the Just Transition Subcommittee at the right times. And in terms of council feedback, I would think that having it on the agenda to get any comments, if folks have either clarifying questions or things they also want to add, or what have you, that would make a lot of sense. I'm not sure the memo would need to be voted on so long as we had that part of the process, the Climate Council, and then we use it to refresh the process roadmap and the work plan. That's probably how, because those two documents will then be, kind of considered and adopted. Okay, thanks.
Jared?
First, I just want to thank Kelly and Abby and the Just Transitions Subcommittee for developing this and sharing with it. I'm supportive of adding it to the next council agenda for discussion. A couple of the questions that emerge for me are kind of, is there a way to get more clarity about when either something from a council subcommittee or the council should be shared with or reviewed by the Just Transition Subcommittee? It's not clear to me based on this whether basically anything and everything that comes out of subcommittees or that would be developed by the council. It's the desire of the Just Transition Subcommittee to kind of review any of those recommendations, or whether you're anticipating that it is kind of a subset that are more directly related to kind of equity analysis and just transitions focused topics, which I know that those lines are not always really clear about, when a topic, and we see that in terms of which subcommittees should, sometimes there's overlapping areas of responsibility. And so that's just the main question that this memo raises for me, is just so that we're all clear, both folks on the Just Transition Subcommittee and folks on other subcommittees and on the council, is kind of how wide is that funnel in terms of what eventually gets shared with and reviewed by the Just Transition Subcommittee. And then from there, I think that'll be really important to get clarity on as we look at the update of the next climate action plan, so we could work backwards from a timeline to give sufficient review, if it's not just recommendations coming up from a subcommittee, but also then having to have review processes from other subcommittees. And to me, it raises the question of, it's like, this is a very specific instance, but when are the moments when other subcommittees should be reviewing other subcommittees' work? So those are just some of I don't have answers on this. Those are just some of the questions that this memo raises for me. But overall, thank you so much for doing this work, and I look forward to discussing it more in the council meeting, and definitely fully support it being added as an agenda item.
Yeah, a quick that is something that has come up, and there's obviously no hard and fast answer. The hope is that this is helping hold people accountable, and every policy proposal that we consider as subcommittees or councils, we should be considering equity in all of them. So it's not like only some of the things we're doing need to have an equity or justice consideration. It should be throughout the process from start to finish. So of course, the Just Transition Subcommittee can't hear every single conversation, every single idea. That's not gonna be possible. So I think that's where us making sure that we have liaisons from the subcommittee, from Just Transition Subcommittee to the other subcommittees, is going to be a helpful thing, because I think that's when it's a little bit more of an ongoing support and holding people accountable throughout the process, but also that person may be able to help identify, oh, hey, this one's got a lot of things we need to consider. Why don't you do a deeper dive as a subcommittee or a task group and bring it to the Just Transition Subcommittee for more questions, because that'll bring a wider variety of people's lived experience and expertise and things if we bring it to the full Just Transition Subcommittee. So that's sort of where I was thinking we landed, because there's no really clear, obvious criteria that we can put a list and these things need to go to Just Transitions, these things don't. It's going to come up as the things rise up to the top, I think. Abby, I don't know if you have other thoughts or anything to add on that.
And I think it's a good question, Jared, and I think, to be honest, our subcommittee has also wavered on, what's a realistic and practical level of engagement for our subcommittee to have as recommendations and policies and program or budget considerations to the council are being discussed. And so I think that Kelly did do a great job of describing that there are multiple ways that the engagement can happen with the Just Transition Subcommittee and utilization and consideration of the guiding principles in the scoring rubric. One is about the embedded Just Transition Subcommittee members in subcommittees and task groups, and obviously on the council. And the second is actually, when should content come to the Just Transition Subcommittee for review and discussion? And I think we may get better and clearer on that, whether there is a bright line there some time into the future, but certainly it feels when there's recommendations that the Climate Council is making, so like in the process of developing or in the future revising the action plan, that feels very clearly something that would be relevant to bring to the subcommittee, the Just Transition Subcommittee. But I agree, there's also this many iterative relationship building phase that would happen through the integration of Just Transition Subcommittee members in other groups. So I don't know that I provided any additional clarity, but I think it's going to be both.
Well, thanks for both asking the question and trying to respond. I expect that's a question that will come up at the council meeting as well, that people will want to, so good start to that conversation. So the action that is required, and it sounds like everybody is supportive of considering putting this on the council agenda for the consideration by the full council. And the steering committee at least has suggested that it can be adopted in a couple different ways, but ultimately, I guess the council can decide whether it wants to take a formal vote. You could ask for a formal vote as the Just Transition Subcommittee, or whether it gets just incorporated into both the process document or the work plan, or perhaps, as was suggested. Okay, any other comments on this before we move to the agenda items for the next council meeting? Yes, Jane.
Kelly came off mute, and maybe Kelly was fortuitous to bring this up also, but one of the other rationales for flagging this on the agenda today was to highlight an issue that's coming up with subcommittee recruitment, and Just Transitions is a good committee to highlight that challenge and process that I think needs to really be thought about for the process roadmap. And so maybe I'll just hand it back over to Kelly. I just didn't want it to go by because it's something that's really important.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to bring up, Jane. And it's just something that we would like to recruit more members to our subcommittee. We aren't sure what the best way is to go about it, but in some discussions with some of a few of the leadership members of our subcommittee, I think we all want it to be a transparent and inclusive process. And so we'd love some guidance on that. And it might be something that we should be considering having the same kind of recruiting process for all of the subcommittees. So we didn't want to just go off and do it all on our own without coming back to you or the council as a whole for guidance. But we would like more members, and we'd like to recruit them soon.
And can you go ahead, Jane?
I was just going to flag that the Just Transition Subcommittee, 2 of their subcommittee members are now on contract with the Climate Action Office. So there's a gap in representation with 2 members stepping down and others transitioning off. So they could certainly use some new membership. And then just think that giving due diligence and thought about the subcommittee composition across the board, how folks are recruited, how folks are, if they're appointed to subcommittees indefinitely, are there term limits, or like with counselors to reconsider appointments, give folks a chance to step off and step on. those are questions that did not tackle very clearly in the process roadmap, and think that especially as we prep for Senate transition as well as the next climate action plan, I think it would be really helpful to think that through. And just one other comment about subcommittee is that we have 2 new counselors who we haven't appointed them to a subcommittee yet, and the process for how to assign support counselors and moving to subcommittees is something also that hasn't been clearly set out. So yeah, there's just a lot to think about and a process that's not clear right now.
And am I taking away from this conversation that this is sort of another relatively urgent question? I mean, we've already tagged it for the steering committee, but it's a pretty urgent question that needs to be advanced by the steering committee as soon as possible. I don't know if that's something that with an extra meeting between now and the council that could be at least, the conversation could start on that, but just want to confirm, I guess, that this is something that you would like to have done as soon as possible so that you can actually move forward getting new council members or new subcommittee members. All right. Thank you very much, Kelly. I really appreciate you and Abby coming and sharing this with the steering committee. And with that sort of goes to our council meeting agenda. If you don't have it in front of you, I can share again. Sort of the items that we put on the agenda as starting place for this conversation. One is the Just Transition Subcommittee memo, the biomass task group recommendations right above that. The first item listed is action item, more general conversation about action items from the March council meeting. So similar to the conversation we had today about what is it that the steering committee is likely to be able to take on and in what way, what the climate office is taking on. And then specifically, we are putting before the biomass task group recommendations the issue of how to proceed with discussing and adopting addendums. Thinking that if possible, the steering committee actually could have another meeting, and that's sort of the next agenda item below today. But if you could advance that for consideration by the council before they actually, so that they understand what is the decision-making process going to look like, how does this fit into the overall climate action plan, and they know, they sort of have an understanding of that before they actually start the discussion of the actual recommendations. Yes, Julie.
I just want to flag that we've already adopted one addendum, and I don't want to hold the biomass task group report to a different standard. We adopted the transportation task group's recommendations at a previous council meeting, and feel strongly we need to have better clarity on that going forward. But I do think the biomass task group recommendation should be put through the same process we put the transportation work group recommendations, where they're presented to the council, discussed by the council for an up or down vote. And then we can think about what improvements to that process are needed. But I'm concerned about holding them to a different standard.
And Catherine, that was the issue that I talked about earlier. So I would just add that I agree with Julie. I think going forward is a separate issue, but we should treat this the same way we have treated the transportation, and as an addendum that was kind of left over from work that didn't make it into the climate action plan because of timing.
So Jared, you're nodding your head in agreement. Liz, how are you feeling about this? Because if we have agreement on that as the process going forward, then maybe we don't need to take it up.
Yeah, no, I'm comfortable with that, because the intention of the biomass task group as a whole was that this be taken up by the council, back in September, right? And then I think it was put off till November, and then we all know the history. So I do think that if we can treat this the same as the other addendum that we've already adopted that was originally intended to be adopted on the same timeline, draw a line and move on from there. That feels acceptable. Obviously, I'm just one person who sat in on that task group, but I think the most important thing from where I've sat anyway is to make sure that council discussion occurs so that whatever else has to be discussed in this realm, and as we all know, there are other topics the task group didn't take up, that can also be done going forward, right? So short version, yes, I think that feels okay to me.
So have I canvassed all the steering committee members on that issue, just to be sure? I think so. Okay, well, if that's the case, then I guess that would be the proposal to the council that with the presentation of the recommendations. And
Can I just make a comment, Catherine, real quick?
Yeah.
Sorry, just because there's been so much tension with biomass, I don't really want this to sit out there. So I do just want to clarify that in our thinking about this, we've always been thinking that biomass was in line. It's an update that was required to the initial climate action plan, and we've always envisioned treating it differently and drawing a line between once biomass and transportation were adopted, then the question about process for addendums was after that. And then as far as the timing for biomass, just also to clarify, because there's been some misconceptions about timeline and how things got moved. There was supposed to be an update on biomass recommendations at the November meeting of the council, but transportation ran long, and therefore that update never happened. But however, there was no action ever intended at the November meeting. The council was intended to take action and have a substantive conversation in December, but because of council appointments, couldn't in good faith meet with 8 councilors not having appointments. And then that has led to this challenge of a process of dragging on the timeline. But just to clarify timeline. And then just final comment about, I think that where Catherine and we're getting a little intertwined is that in order to, in good faith, move forward with adopting the biomass task group recommendations, David and others had suggested that the challenge of how we vote and amend recommendations at the council meeting felt flawed when we took up transportation. And there was a question really about process for how we move to vote and how we consider addendums to the addendum and changes in real time. And that was something David had been advocating, that as part of the process roadmap, we would surely be thinking about how voting and discussion takes place, but that might be something we want to do sooner rather than later so that we can test that process when we take up biomass, as we know there are a lot of feelings about what those recommendations should and shouldn't look like. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. I guess I did not know all the backstory on that process for the transportation task group. And I'm still a little bit unclear, me personally, maybe nobody else is, about, so does that mean that you are suggesting that there is at least a need to be very specific about what that process was and if there were any need for any improvements? Oops, she just walked away. Never mind.
She's just grabbing her charger. Maybe I'll just offer a reflection on the process on the transportation side, the decision around that addendum. I think part of the challenge is that, in an ideal situation, both I think from the council's perspective, or at least I'll speak from my individual perspective, and from the perspective of CBI, what I've heard a lot of people say is that, when we can get there, we'd like to arrive at consensus. But I think with some of these topics, certainly the transportation recommendations, and I think it's probably likely as well with the biomass recommendations, there will be situations when we simply need to call for a vote. And I think that one of the things that led to a longer and more confusing process with the transportation recommendations was this desire to get to consensus when there was not a possibility to get to consensus. And so for my perspective, it's really just having a willingness on the front end to have a vote on recommendations before the council. I think it gets trickier when there are dueling recommendations. So I don't know, because I don't think that's really addressed in the process roadmap, and we're not kind of following Robert's rules. But I do think we need to have kind of an order of operations of considering one recommendation first, and before moving to another. But I recognize that there's some gray area there, but I that's my reflection on where some of the challenge was.
So Jane, I just said as you walked away, and I think Jared's helped clarify that, is that what the point that you made, I'm taking to say, yes, this is like the transportation, but yes, there was also some confusion in that process. So let's make sure that everybody's clear about any refinements or small tweaks that need to be made in order to be clear about how we're going to vote, when we're going to vote, how that relates to deliberations of the council at large. Is that right? So you're still saying that there's at least needs to be mentioned and acknowledged if there are improvements.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in just looking back at the items proposed for the April meeting, I don't think anybody's questioning whether or not biomass should be a focus of that meeting. And I would encourage us, knowing that that is going to be a conversation that has different viewpoints, that we should really sort of think about what can wait on this agenda. As I suggested earlier, I would propose that the update from the Climate Action Office can come at the meeting after. And as much as I really think the Just Transitions memo is super important, would ask you all if that should be waited till the following meeting also, and really try to give as much time as possible to biomass. And in prep for that, just spend a few minutes talking about how action is going to be taken on those recommendations around voting, around addendums to recs, things like that, because I just think going in with clear expectations will be important, so that lack of clarity around how to get there isn't ambiguous when we start.
Okay.
And time. We always overpack our agendas, and biomass is going to get a lot of time.
Well, does the steering committee want to proactively make a decision on what items we might need to move to the next meeting?
I mean, I think one of the ways that we can address that is just the order of the agenda. And I agree with Jane that given the amount of conversation that might need to happen with that, so that everybody's feeling like their voices are heard, that it's important that biomass come ahead of some of the other ones. And if we finish early and still have time for the remaining agenda items, that's great. But if it's clear as we go through the conversation that we need to provide more time for the biomass conversation, then maybe the order of the agenda helps make that decision for us. I think it's then just a question of decision making on the fly about, and this puts more pressure on the facilitators about, when to extend an agenda item and allow something that's towards the end of an agenda to move to the next meeting if necessary, so that we feel good and confident about the process and decision for things earlier on the agenda.
Yeah, and just out of consideration, let Kelly and Abby know that this may be, the Just Transition memo may get bumped if that's the way we want to handle it. So they're aware that there has been some conversation around making sure that the biomass task group recommendations get as much time as needed. Any objections to that approach? Okay. So I guess the last item here before public comment is a question about the steering committee's let me make sure I haven't missed anything else on the council agenda. The steering, no, it looks like we covered that all. The steering committee's interest in having another meeting before the April council member in preparation for that. In part, I would think to possibly address the issue of the, well, one of the things was going to be some of the process roadmap, more urgent issues like the recruitment of subcommittee members. And then the other one was how do we adopt agendas, but it seems like we've addressed that. So that's not as necessarily going to take as much time unless you want to take that up beforehand. Jane.
Sorry, and maybe just with support of CPI, I wanted to frame this as a two-part. Since I set the steering committee meetings calendar generally, it would be helpful for me if you all, one, agree to start to think about a cadence for meetings, and then I can pull you to think about regularly set meetings, and I might suggest monthly meetings that we have on the calendar, knowing that it's hard to pull you all together on an ad hoc basis. So I'd like to start to think about a regular cadence that works for you all. And then second, understanding that we've had, if it's once a month, that we've had this meeting now, but ask you if you feel like there's a need to come back together one extra time this month before the council meeting, or feel like there's enough to go on to move forward without another meeting. So just wanted to say those two things, so we're not just sort of piecemeal scheduling you all on a monthly basis as I have been, and would like to just have something on the calendar. And I'm hopeful we'll get to that with the council too, so you all have a regular cadence and we don't have to poll all the time.
Just briefly on that, Jane, I agree. I think that ideally the steering committee is meeting kind of in between the council meetings in terms of being able to prepare for the agendas. And so they somewhat go hand in hand, but I would be more than happy to do a regular monthly schedule. And, if there's ever a time in which we don't have a council meeting, every month, then we might pull some off of the calendar, but I think it's better to hold a monthly time and take away rather than to do it in the ad hoc way for the reasons you said.
And I think that makes sense as well. It's much easier to take a meeting off the schedule than put one on. I also, just to address your second question, which is, do we need to meet again? I think that we're all in agreement that the biomass discussion will take up the bulk of the next steering climate council meeting. So I'm not sure, given that we would need an additional meeting. But if folks feel differently, I'm happy to try and get one of those on the books.
The other item that you might want to give, probably not an hour and a half to, but sometime thought to, is how you would want to present your recommendations on how the action items from the meeting be handled going forward. This is what we discussed at the top of the agenda today. Maybe you can do that offline as well. I mean, one thing we can do is just draft that agenda for the council based on your input today. And then when you look at it, decide whether you need more time to think about how to present that.
I think that's fine.
Okay. Liz, any objections to that? Well, okay. So sort of decide as we go. We'll get a draft agenda to you. And if there's, we need obviously some spokesperson to speak on behalf of the steering committee in terms of recommendations, and we'll need, I guess it's up to you as to whether or not you want to have a couple of slides that address the conversation we had. Okay, well, it sounds like we are ready now then to turn to public comment. And I see we have a lot of public on this call. And so to help me, as I tried in the last meeting, to just manage making sure that everybody gets a chance who wants to have a comment, gets a chance to have a comment. I definitely would love to know who would like to make a comment. So if you could raise your hand, I see 2 so far. If you could raise your hand, and And then if we can apportion the time
Should we
equally,
just get started, Catherine? We all kind of know how to do it. We've been here.
if we
that
could,
times.
yeah, excuse me, Cheryl, if we could apportion the time more equally among everybody so that everybody has a chance to talk, that would be super helpful. We had some trouble with that at the last meeting, so. So only 2 comments, it looks like. Only 2 individuals have comments today. So Cheryl and Judy. Cheryl, do you want to go first?
I just have a quick clarification, and that is that in December, the biomass recommendations were ready for being looked at, and the decision was made to not look at them at that time because there was one member from there was one place that was unfilled. So I just want to point out that they were ready, but the decision was made to not look at them right off the bat.
If I might, I'll just clarify that real quick, since Cheryl Joy, I know this has been a concern, and I just want to clarify that there were 8 House members who were not appointed to the council. So it wasn't 1 member, it was 8 seats that were vacant. And the challenge was generally associated with there was also a challenge, 8 seats vacant, of which it was determined that many of them fit critical seats to consider biomass, like rural voice seat was not sitting on the council, as well as economy and fuel dealers. And then second, the administration would have had a majority on the council, and which was clearly not the intent of the GWSA. So there were multiple reasons for why the council chose not to meet until those 8 seats were reappointed.
Jane, was it?
And those didn't
December?
happen until January.
Was-
I'm sorry,
was it-
what?
It was January then? Did I get the month wrong? It was January?
As of the middle of January, the appointments had still not been made. And we're still, as of now, missing 1 seat now. So now that's why we're moving forward, because only 1 seat is vacant right now, the fuel dealer seat.
Thank you for the clarification. Thanks for your question. Judy.
Thank you. I would like to address a lot of what you were talking about when you were talking about creating a workforce. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the report of the executive director of racial equity, but in that report, they express concern of ever expanding list of work groups that focus on equity issues. It's growing at a pace that is not commensurate with the actual need for more work groups. And then they go on and list what you should be doing, whether new work groups are needed for a particular task or topic, whether existing work groups can take on any new duties needed, whether a new work group needs to exist in perpetuity or can serve as a task and finish. Groups will dissolve after a certain milestone is met, whether work groups will call upon the same set of community members who are already sit on a municipal work groups, whether the compensation for the work groups is appropriate given the amount of work, what work product are deliverable to expect a new working group, and how it will be effectively utilized by the state. And they go on to mention further the siloing of the work could create duplicating work, parallel work groups, requires thoughtful planning. And then they go on to talk about getting a complete BIPOC committee together from the workforce. And so if you draw from limited committees, you probably will end up with a workforce that is not BIPOC. Also, I want to bring your attention to the open meeting laws. Again, they discussed a lot of what you asked for. Somebody said they wanted to see some possibilities how in public might work. The possibilities are listed in the open meeting law. And the one that is suggested is that we believe it's best practice to allow the public to comment on each item as the board proceeds through the agenda. And had you allowed that, you would have heard from me about the executive director racial equality report before you had this big, long discussion about creating a new task force or a new committee, whatever you want to call it. So I think what I would do is make a suggestion that you familiarize yourself with some of the laws Vermont already has. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Judy. And I also wanted just to acknowledge there have been some comments in the chat, which will capture particularly about the public engagement process that you referred to and the expectations there. So to the extent that CBI is going to be taking on some thinking about that, I appreciate that those comments are coming through in the chat as well. And there is one more comment from Pike Porter.
Yes, thanks for taking my comment. I wanted to reiterate my concerns that these are 5 minutes at the very end when many of the steering committee members have already left. It seems like if you value public comments, you'll put it where all steering committee members will be listening. And I'd also like to encourage the make open to the public, at least for viewing, the life cycle analysis work that the Energy Resource Group is doing. That work is pretty crucial to the whole process, and right now it's being done in an opaque manner. We can't even watch the meetings or the group that's going on there. So I would like to ask that those be open so that we can watch those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Porter. Any other comments from the steering committee regarding the public comments that you just heard? Okay. Well, I appreciate you, the public sticking with us. I acknowledge this was at the end, and we will be continuing this conversation about the public comment and how to make it as effective as possible. And with that, I'll close out this steering committee meeting, and we will, I guess, to be determined whether you'll be convened again before April, the next April council meeting, but appreciate your input in development of that council agenda. Thanks very much.
Could I ask one
Everyone.
clarifying question from Jane, please?
Yes. Yes.
So Jane, in December, when there wasn't sufficient people to meet, did you have a quorum?
Yeah, quorum, well, I can't speak to if we had a quorum. I can speak to that quorum is determined based on the number of sitting councilors. So it's not determined based on the vacancies. It would have been determined based on the 15 members, yeah.
So I believe what Cheryl was getting at was there was a quorum, but they still decided not to vote on it because so many were meeting.
Yes, I believe the interest was because for the two reasons I just spoke to, lack of representation of certain seats and the administration having the majority, there was a determination that it wasn't prudent to meet.
And is that usually the process for other committees?
I'm not sure.
Did you void out listening to comments and stuff from transportation for the same reason? Or did you listen to them?
That happened yet. The seats were still occupied for transportation. They lapsed at the end of November.
Because I brought the issue up at Social Equity Caucus, and they said you should have discussed it, that it was inappropriate for you not to. That's why I was asking.
It wasn't my decision. It was the decision of the council. So I'm just answering based on my understanding of how it worked.
Thank you.
All right. All have a good week and stay tuned for updates via email. Thanks very much.